Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Inside the Americas. Here's a look at what's coming up in today's show. The California wildfires are now on their way to becoming the biggest in state history. The quest to keep convicted child molesters away from children has left many of them in unsanitary living conditions in Florida. And political crisis in Honduras as the TV star opposition leader accuses the re-elected president of stealing the election. I'm Jeannie Godula. First up, our number of the week, 100,000. That's for the more than 100,000 hectares destroyed in the California fires so far. The so-called Thomas Fire is on course to become the largest in the state's modern history. The blazes have been raging since the beginning of December, destroying over 1,000 homes.
Falling temperatures and rising humidity. A much-needed respite for the 8,500 firefighters who've been battling blazes in California for the last 2 weeks. The weather conditions in the western state are still delicate.
We were able to do prepping in these areas days before to allow the fire to burn around some of these homes. We were able to fire out some of them, but unfortunately, when you have winds that severe, you just physically cannot save every home.
The Thomas Fire has been raging through Southern California since December 4th, fanned by strong winds reaching speeds of up to 130 kilometers an hour. Authorities say it's one of the largest and most devastating fires in the dry state's history.
Currently, as of this morning, we are the third largest fire in California history. So strong winds out of the north pushing the fire back downhill, so extremely gusty, cold, and relatively humidity being low. It's a very hazardous firefight.
Since this summer, firefighters in California have hardly had a moment's rest. The region has had an unprecedented dry season, with dozens of people killed in a series of fires. California Governor Jerry Brown has referred to it as a consequence of climate change. This year, the state has been struck by 5 of its most destructive fires since 1932.
The picture that marked the Americas the most this week was this one, a U.S. train broken over an overpass, toppling cars onto the highway below. The Amtrak train crashed outside Seattle on the very first run of a new fast route created by an upgrade to freight tracks. But crucially, the rush to launch the new service meant critical speed control technology that could have prevented a derailment was not active before the train set off. Dozens of people were hurt and 3 killed, including one of the most respected train advocates in the country. Next now to Florida, where convicted pedophiles are on record for life. Their identity, their addresses, and their pictures are all made public and available on the internet. There are even tougher restrictions in Miami, where registered sex offenders cannot live within 2,500 feet of a school, daycare, or playground. But with construction booming and population growing, the limitations of the law are starting to show. Sex offenders are now being housed in makeshift camps. That massive gathering of sexual predators is raising concern, but so are the inhuman living conditions for these men who've already served their time. Marion Lippmann reports.
In Miami, this is known as the Hell Camp, temperatures reaching over 40 degrees Celsius. Here, the homeless hide from prying eyes. They've all been convicted of child abuse.
What you want, old man? Come on in here.
Greg spent 9 years in jail for child pornography. Since his release last year, his daily life has become a second sentence.
This is my house. It's a mess. We can get water around the corner here. Bathrooms are at Winn-Dixie, which is a little over a half a mile that way. If it's an emergency, you better hold it until you get there. My dogs that live up in Texas have a better life than I do.
In Miami-Dade County, sex offenders cannot live within 800 meters of any school, playground, or daycare. As a result, they're forced to live in makeshift tent camps in this industrial area. 270 sex offenders are registered here. like 75-year-old Isandro.
My niece has got a room over there that I could, but they say, no, we can't stay over there because it isn't an area, you know, of school.
They're forced to stay here or else risk going back to jail, a situation many in the neighborhood find scary and worrying. Steve Grafton's designer furniture shop is located just 200 meters away from the slum. He says the number of customers visiting his shop is dropping dramatically.
My customers are afraid to drive by there. They ask me all the time, what is that? Many ladies that work here have to leave before it becomes nighttime because they're afraid that something is going to happen.
To find a solution and relocate the sex offenders, Miami appointed Ronald Book, the lobbyist who initiated the 800-meter rule in the first place. The struggle for him is a personal one. His daughter was raped when she was 11.
They committed a crime that our society has said, we're going to treat you different for the rest of your lives. And that's just the way it is. I don't want them living near where children congregate. I don't want them living near parks and playgrounds and daycare centers. I don't.
But Ronald Book doesn't approve of the unsanitary conditions at the camp. Split between his respect for human dignity and his will to protect children, he's been trying to find a place to relocate the sex offenders for 3 years. Yet few at the camp trust him.
Bullshit. I mean, they can close down as far as I'm concerned. They're the ones that put us out of here. The state, the county's the one that put us out of here. We're not here as a North Shore. They put us out of here.
Today, few people are prepared to defend sex offenders. Gail Coletta's son was convicted for child pornography and she became their spokesperson. She's asking for the repeal of the 800-meter rule.
It makes no sense. Some 19-year-old boy who had a consensual relationship with his 15-year-old girlfriend, he's on the registry. He's subject to all of the same restrictions as some 50-year-old guy who abducted, molested an 8-year-old. And they're completely different types of offenses, but they are treated the same.
But despite her fight, legislation could get even tougher. A legal ordinance could make the camps illegal. If approved, all those living there would have to find a new place to hide.
Let's take a look now at what made headlines in Latin America this week. Peruvians are set to vote on whether or not to impeach their president. Pedro Pablo Kuczynski has been linked to Latin America's biggest corruption scandal. The 79-year-old leader was elected last year after campaigning on a pledge to clean up corruption. Argentina has voted to reform the country's pension system. The congressional motion will shorten the intervals of pension adjustment from 6 months to 3 months and increase the pensions according to inflation rates. That means the growth of the pensions people receive may shrink year after year. Tens of thousands of people turned out ahead of that vote in protests that turned violent, with 160 hurt. And Chile elected a new president this week. Conservative Sebastián Piñera won after a campaign where he voiced concerns about the country's declining birth rate and took aim at changes to abortion law made under his predecessor, Michelle Bachelet. Her leaving office next March will mark the end of a generation of women leaders in Latin America. Just 7 years ago, women held the top jobs in Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, and Chile. Another election now in Honduras, where the president has declared himself re-elected nearly a month after the vote took place. That contentious election has been marred by claims of fraud and weeks of violent protests. But opposition candidate Salvador Nasrallah has rejected the result, calling for a revote. Ivana Scatola reports.
President Juan Orlando Hernandez spoke for the first time since electoral authorities announced his victory on Sunday, nearly 3 weeks after the disputed November 26th vote took place.
The acceptance of the will of nearly 3.5 million Hondurans will bring peace, harmony and progress. As President-elect of all Hondurans, I humbly accept the will of the Honduran people.
But leftist opposition candidate Salvador Nasrallah rejects the result and is calling for a rerun with greater international scrutiny. He claims there was gross electoral fraud, insisting ballots were tampered with after the vote, and that unusual pauses in the count, which dragged out for more than a week, were suspicious. He was in Washington on Tuesday to present what he claims is evidence of that fraud to the Secretary of the Organization of the American States.
I ask that the OAS abstain from approving the election results published by the Supreme Court and not to recognize Hernandez's new electoral mandate. I also ask that they suspend aid to what is an unconstitutional government.
The announcement on Sunday sparked a new wave of protests. Anti-Hernandez demonstrators and police have repeatedly squared off in the past few weeks, often ending in violence, which authorities say has claimed 3 deaths. But both the opposition and Amnesty International say the number is much higher.
Well, Christmas is coming, so we thought we'd leave you now with a look at some volunteer Santas in Venezuela. They are making it their mission to help people who need a little Christmas cheer this time of year. Santa en las Calles is a voluntary activity that groups people together and supports vulnerable populations, whether it be in a community, a foster home, a nursing home, or a care center with limited resources, or even on the city streets. We'll leave you with that. Merry Christmas to you if you celebrated. Thanks for watching Inside the Americas. We'll see you again next week for all the news from north to south.
Reporters Plus, presented by Mark Owen.
The White Army, young soldiers ready to defend their people, the Nur. This rebel ethnic minority is a collateral victim of South Sudan's endless war. It is struggling to fend off attacks by opposing tribes and the government. Civilians caught in the middle of a humanitarian crisis are setting off in the hope of finding a better life.
Reporters Plus, on France 24 and France24.com.